Today, I would like to discuss a very important topic, that is African continental economic integration schemes. This short presentation or discussion or lecture is aimed for university students in South Sudan, especially those majoring in economics, political science, law, development studies, and of course it could also be useful to other people that are interested in economic integration in Africa. The lecture will be divided into past a background to continental economic integration, a brief outline of that background, and the way forward. In particular, I will outline Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, and in that I will outline or elaborate a little bit on the African continental free trade area as a way forward. By way of background, I will look at the colonial economic order, then post-independence integration in Africa, that is the OAU and its economic flagship integration schemes. Then we move to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We will look at funding, the AfCFTA, and in particular, I will see China-Africa cooperation as a major source of funding. I hope then I will look at implementation challenges to the AfCFTA. I hope that these 30 minutes or so will be useful, especially to those students that will listen to them later on. In terms of African colonial economic order, we must not skip slave trade and the scramble for Africa. The transatlantic slave trade relied on slave labor from Africa. The Industrial Revolution, of course, led to rising demand for industrial materials, and Africa provides that. The Berlin Conference, 1884, that brought together 13 European countries plus the United States, was the beginning of the scramble for Africa. And Africa was partitioned according to the General Act. The General Act of the Berlin Conference was based on the principle of effective occupation of these partitioned territories and continuation of forced slave labor. That is almost slave labor, because these territories became sources of raw materials for the industries in Europe in particular. The post-independence integration schemes, in terms of that, we look at the Organization of African Unity in 1963, and its main objective, it was Africa's first post-independence continental institution, and the charter of the AU of the OAU talks of freedom, equality, justice, and dignity that was not in colonial Africa, defending sovereignty and independence, and eradication of all forms of colonialism, coordination and cooperation among African states, and raising living standards for all Africans, dispute settlement, and of course the Organization of African Unity is considered a precursor to a stronger unity, because there were two blocks that were discussing African integration immediately in the period post-independence. The Casablanca bloc believed in immediate integration, believed in federalism, a federation of African states, and deep integration, that there is no need to wait for later integration. Africa needed to be integrated, African states needed to be integrated immediately. The believers of that opinion, of course, were mostly countries in North Africa, and a couple of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. In North Africa, you have people like Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Then you have people like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Toure. You have people like in Guinea, the president of Guinea. They were all for immediate integration, deep integration. And you have the Monrovia bloc, led by prominent African presidents such as Kwame Nkrumah, who called for a united state of Africa. And these two competing ideas of African integration focused on one thing. They aimed on to achieve one thing, but through different paths. At the end, the Monrovia bloc, led by those of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, prevailed. Their idea of gradual integration of Africa prevailed, leading to the formation of the Organization of African Unity. But over its 36 years, the OAU was criticized for being a talking shop. It brought so many ideals, but did not implement those ideals. It was seen as a toothless organization, so divided, and a club of dictators. That is why later schemes, such as the ones brought by the African Union, benefited from that criticism and sought to correct the mistakes of the Organization of African Unity. One of the flagship economic programs of the OAU was the Lagos Plan of Action for the Economic Development of Africa, which was launched in 1980. It went for 30 years. It ended with the start of the African Union in 2000. The Lagos Plan of Action looked at the structural adjustment programs. Of course, this is a program of the World Bank, IMF, and IMF. Students that are studying economics worldwide, but in particular in the third world, and in Africa in particular, always study structural adjustment programs with a lot of criticism. The structural adjustment programs put conditionalities, such as removing subsidies from the agricultural sector, for example, from very important sector, from healthcare, from energy sector, and while these subsidies are maintained in the industrial world. Decreased reliance on extractive raw materials. These were all aimed of the Lagos Plan of Action. Of course, we know that Africa relies on extractive raw materials to finance African countries, that is, to finance their budget. And it also talked about reliance on development aid from the West, trying to remove Africa from, to stop reliance on development aid. The plan of action also talks of agriculture as the foundation of self-sufficiency. But all these ideals, all these ideas failed. That is why the OAU was looked at, was considered as a talking shop, because it brought up great ideas but implemented little, if at all. The Lagos Plan of Action was structured in terms of food and agriculture, industrial development, natural resources, human resource development, science and technology, transport and communication, trade and finance, energy, planning and statistics. All these areas were discussed thoroughly, but nothing was implemented. The second flagship program of it is actually the first economic flagship program of the African Organization of African Union, was the African Economic Community, that was launched in 1991. The structure of the African Economic Community included the Assembly of Heads of State and Government, Council of Ministers, the Pan-African Parliament, that is in Pretoria, South Africa now. We have the Court of Justice in Arusha, Tanzania. We have a General Secretariat. We have special technical committees. Chapter 4 talks about regional economic communities. I think that in particular is one of the success stories of the Organization of African Unity, because those economic communities, let us look at the East African Economic Community, for example, that was established by Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Milton Obote in Uganda, and Mzee Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. The East African Community was operational. Railway workers, for example, were deployed. Tanzanian railway workers were deployed to work in Uganda and Kenya. Kenyans were deployed to work in Tanzania and Uganda, and so on and so forth. So the East African Community as a regional economic bloc succeeded for a while. We have as well other regional economic blocs, such as SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. We have COMESA that brings Central and Southern African economies together. And you have the North as well. There is an economic community there. So at least these were economic communities brought a semblance of integration, even though they were not strong integration as such. Customs union and liberalization of trade, that is chapter 5 of the African Economic Community, talks of elimination of customs duties within these regional economic communities, which happened actually for a while, eliminating non-tariff barriers such as roadblocks and the rest, establishing a common external tariff where goods will come from the outside world into these regional economic communities and should not be taxed by each and every country that these goods go through. Freedom of movement of persons, rights of residence and establishment. This is establishment of business, that is money, finance, payments, free movement of capital. Other protocols included energy and natural resources, transportation. So all these ideals were part of the African Economic Community of the Organization of African Unity, but nothing much was achieved. Moving from the OAU, we come to the African Union, which was established to overcome the challenges that the OAU faced and the drawbacks and the failures of the OAU. One of the most important or the foundation, the flagship economic program of the AU has been the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. NEPAD talks of socio-economic development. It's the lead organization for Africa's economic partnership with the rest of the world, such as with the UN and the rest of the world. Of course, it is also an African Union Development Agency, because it has also an African Union Development Agency in the sense that it just like the USAID is a US development agency, NEPAD also established an Africa-wide development agency that will help build capacity of African states, coordinate trade between Africa and the rest of the world. Africa as a single bloc, seen as a single economic bloc, that is, and execute regional and continental projects. It will spearhead all these ideas. There are 6 broad thematic areas of these 6 broad thematic areas of the new partnership for Africa's development are economic integration, which is also part of the predecessor, that is the OAU, industrialization, environmental sustainability, technology innovation and digitization, knowledge management, and 6, human capital and institutions development. Of course, the difference between these ideals and the ideals of the OAU is that these ideals, there is a lot of investment into implementing these new targets of the AU, while the targets of the OAU were talked about without injecting funds. Now the main topic of today, which is the Agenda 2063, and mainly the African Continental Free Trade Area. But the flagship projects, the flagship projects of Agenda 2063 are 15. I will read them fast. Number one is integrated high-speed train network. Of course, Africa is very huge. The map is deceptive. Africa is very huge, and to have this integrated high-speed train network all across Africa will be a very expensive enterprise, but it is doable. Formulation of an African commodity strategy. Number three, establishment of an Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which I will elaborate on a little bit later. The African passport, that is on the way. Silencing the guns by 2020. These ideals has not been met because the guns have not been silenced in Africa. But at least we can see that regional economic communities have worked towards silencing the guns in their regions. ECOWAS, for example, through its military wing, ECOMOC, has intervened in Sierra Leone, in Liberia. It brought peace in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and it came to Gambia, wanted to intervene militarily when, if you remember, a couple of years ago, Gambia's dictator Yahya Jammeh was defeated in elections and refused to cede, to give up power. So ECOMOC wanted to intervene, and he saw that he was going to be captured and probably killed. So ECOMOC has been effective in trying to bring stability in West Africa. SADC also has been intervening in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, for example. They have intervened. In DRC, they have intervened as well. And we have intervention by the East African community, the East African Standby Force, led by Kenya and Uganda. It has also brought some stability to Somalia, defeated Al-Shabaab and chased and pushed them away from major towns, even though there are drawbacks every now and then. Al-Shabaab, like yesterday, they come up with car bombs in the capital Mogadishu, but generally speaking, Somalia is a better place because of the intervention of the African Standby Force. And the same, it is now intervening in the DRC Congo. And by the way, South Sudan has sent a battalion as part of the African Standby Force to stabilize DRC Congo. So silencing the guns as a target has not been achieved within the set framework 2020, but again, there are commendable steps towards attaining that. Implementation of the Grand Inga Dam project. This is flagship project number 6. Of course, we know that without energy, no country or no region or no continent can develop economically, can attain economic growth and development. So because of the importance of the River Congo and the potential, the hydroelectric potential it holds, the African Union, one of the flagship projects of Agenda 2063 is implementation of the Grand Inga Dam project in the DRC. It holds the Congo River Basin holds almost 40% of world hydroelectric power potential. Imagine one country holding 40% of hydroelectric power potential in the world. That is the Democratic Republic of Congo, in addition to all other resources that this giant African country is blessed with. Of course, the whole continent will go and look for funding for this Grand Inga Dam project, so that cheap power, cheap electricity will be part of life in Africa. Of course, we also see what is happening in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also providing energy through the GERD, that is the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So we are talking about energy as an important ingredient in economic growth and development. Number 7, establishment of a single African air transport market, flying freely all over Africa, especially businessmen. Establishment of an annual African Economic Forum, instead of going to G20, you are invited. Africa needs its own annual economic forum. People, African heads of state, African business communities must come together every year and invite other people to come and discuss economic growth and development in Africa, instead of going to look for resources out of Africa. Number 9, establishment of the African financial institutions. 10, the Pan-African E-Network. 11, African Outer Space Strategy. 12, an African Virtual and E-University, so that Africans will have access to higher learning, because through universities you can learn from your home instead, or it expands access to higher learning on the continent. Cybersecurity, number 13. 14, Great African Museum. The last is Encyclopedia Africana. These are all flagship projects of Agenda 2063 of the African Union. I would outline briefly the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was agreed in 2018. The framework agreement includes a protocol on trade in goods, of course, trade in goods, manufactured goods between African states, or agricultural goods. There is a protocol on trade in services such as financial services, banking, for example, aviation, for example, and medical services, and so on and so forth. There is also a protocol on rules and procedures of settlement of disputes. Of course, this is a very wide area of law. I personally, in my LLB, I studied as well European Economic Community Law. It is the same idea here. It is a very wide area of specialization. So the protocol on rules and procedures of settlement of disputes is a very important area of study if if these students, law students in University of Juba or John Garang Memorial University or other universities in South Sudan want to specialize, these are areas of specialization. The African Continental Free Trade Area was ratified in 2021 by 36 countries, but it was signed by all African states, by 54 African states, as a show of solidarity, as a show of commitment to African integration. All African states signed it, but 36 ratified. Of course, we know the difference between signing and ratification. Signing is just signing, showing that we are committed to these ideals. Ratification, on the other hand, is taking the instrument to your national parliament to debate and pass. It will be signed by the president. Now it becomes part of your national obligations, legal obligations. It becomes part of your own laws. Trade liberalization is, of course, a very important element of the AfCFTA, but it is a gradual liberalization. This is opening up markets for free trade in all over Africa, but because of variation in the level of development, you find that there are countries that are relatively highly developed by African standards: Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Kenya in East Africa, for example. And these countries may get immediate benefits. That's why trade liberalization is taken as a gradual process of 10 to 13 years. You adjust, countries can adjust accordingly, can adjust in terms of protecting certain sectors. For example, if you want to protect your banking sector, then you have the right to prevent other banks from your neighboring countries, from Nigeria, from South Africa, to come to you and control your economy because they are more advanced than you. So you have 10 to 13 years to see that. If you want to protect a certain manufacturing industry, sugar, for example, sugar manufacturing in your country, then the sugar manufacturers in your country, then you can maintain tariffs and customs duties and protect your own industries for 10 to 13 years as you open up gradually. And that applies to almost all other sectors in your economy. The agriculture sector, for example, you can still impose tariffs on agricultural goods coming from these countries because you want your farmers to benefit, fisheries and all other sectors. But that is within a time frame of 10 to 13 years. The Pan-African Private Sector Investment and Trade Committee is part of the AfCFTA, which is tasked with trade policy formulation, continent-wide trade policy formulation. The African Business Forum, also an interaction between heads of state and business communities. It is also a forum that brings African heads of state with the business communities to see the way forward. And it also approves infrastructure financing, such as financing from the World Bank, from China, from the IMF for intra-Africa infrastructure. The aspirations, there are so many aspirations of the AfCFTA, but I would look at aspiration number one, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth. Inclusive growth is to bring all Africans together. Of course, we have been hearing about Africa growth, Africa rising, and the challenge to this narrative of Africa rising from Afro-pessimists in Africa and Afro-skeptics in the rest of the world who say that Africa is not rising. A few African countries are rising, yes, but Africa is not rising. So this aspiration will deal with this issue of the whole of Africa has to rise. That is inclusive growth and sustainable development that is not interrupted by civil wars, development that is not interrupted by breakup of regional integration communities, a breakup of even these ideals of continental integration. Aspiration number 2, we are talking of an integrated continent and politically united. These ideals, the ideals of political unity and integration, that is a federal or a confederate state, united Africa. Remember, these are the ideals of the Casablanca bloc of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, of Jamal Abdel Nasser, Sekou Toure, and those who immediately in the post-independence period sought to have a united state of Africa. But these ideals are now being being recognized by the current generation of African leaders who are calling for the same. Free movement of people, free movement of goods and services, intra-Africa infrastructure connections. African states need to be connected by rail, by road, by sea, by air, by information technology, ICT, and power grids. We talked of the Grand Inga Dam project in DRC, the GERD in Ethiopia, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. They will all provide for power grids, continent-wide power grids that will light the entire Africa. But these power grids have to be financed as well together. Aspiration number 6, an Africa whose development is people-driven. Of course, economic growth and development will not be would not be worthwhile if it is not driven by the people, by a middle class, relying on the potential of the African people, especially its women, youth, and caring for the children of Africa through school feeding programs and access to primary school education in particular, secondary school, of course, and higher and tertiary education as well. Aspiration number 7, Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. Why not? Why can't Africa be a strong, united, and resilient, and influential global player? Africa so far is not Africa is not very strong because it's not a united continent, is not resilient, does not have a strong influence on global affairs. So this aspiration will be realized as part of the AfCFTA. The objectives of the AfCFTA, briefly, creating a single market for goods and services and deepening economic integration of the continent, progressively eliminating tariffs. We talked of 10 to 13 years. And we have 1.3 billion consumers. If you have a single market for 1.3 billion consumers, there will be no fear. even if you are not as developed, South Sudan, for example, is not as developed as Nigeria or South Africa, but looking at 1.3 billion consumers, you will always have customers for your goods. Create a liberalized market, open up these markets through multiple rounds of negotiations. It's not going to be immediate. There will be multiple rounds of negotiations to see how to go about liberalizing these markets. Aid the movement of capital, people, and facilitate investment, of course, through within countries and within regional economic communities. Once this is achieved within regional economic communities, then these economic communities would be linked together, and that will end up into a continental single market. Lay the foundation for establishing a continental customs union. We need a single customs union instead of 54 customs union. It is not practical. If you want a single market, you need a single customs union. Achieve sustainable and inclusive socioeconomic development, gender equality, encourage competitiveness of member states within Africa and in the global market, competitiveness among these African states within competition. All these, the rising tides of economic growth will lift all boats, as the saying goes. Encourage industrial development through diversification and regional value chain development, agricultural development, and food security. The issue of funding. These ideals are good. These ideals are good as ideals, but where will Africa get the money necessary to achieve these ideals, to implement these ideals? One source of funding is China, through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, that was launched in 2000. Of course, China talks about aid, but it's aid and debt at the same time. China pledged $125 billion between 2000 and 2016. We have seen a lot of projects across the continent. We have seen railways, we have seen airports, we have seen seaports, we have seen highways within countries, between countries. China has financed hydroelectric dams in so many African states. So China is a major source of finance for these ideals. The Forum for China-Africa Cooperation is convened every 3 years. Every 3 years. There was one in 2000, 2003 in Addis Ababa, where China pledged 5 billion concessionary loans. These are not loans with high interest. 2006 in Beijing, 2006, 2012, 2018, and in Johannesburg, 2015, in Dakar, 2021, in Sharm el-Sheikh, 2009, in Egypt, the one of Sharm el-Sheikh, and all other FOCAC gatherings, summits, brought more heads of state, African heads of state, in one summit than even the United Nations. More African heads of state go to FOCAC summits than to the United Nations summit. For example, in Sharm el-Sheikh, African presidents and premiers, 49 out of 54 African presidents and premiers attended the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, where China pledged 10 billion low-cost loans. Of course, people are talking about China laying debt traps in Africa that will lead later on to these African countries not being able to pay back these loans. That is like what happened in Europe like 10 years ago. The sovereign debt crisis that happened in Europe, where countries like Greece, Portugal could not pay billions of dollars of European debt. But again, of course, comparing cooperation with China, because China's loans are more concessionary loans than World Bank loans that are based on high interest rates, or IMF loans that are also based on high interest rates, and they led before to sovereign debt crisis in Africa, leading to HIPC initiative, highly indebted countries, poor countries, call for debt relief. And in fact, after these debts to the Western world had been serviced almost more than the principal amount that was given, then these African countries received debt relief, and they started also to get more debt from China. So the fear is that they get relief on one side, on one hand, and on the other hand, they receive also more debts. But all in all, we think that most Africans think that China's rise is benefiting Africa in so many ways, and Chinese debt is different from Western debts, because Chinese debts are closer to aid than debt as such. They have concessionary terms, long term, low interest rates. And China has recently written off billions of dollars, $6-7 billion of these debts to African countries, just to create that partnership between China and Africa. So I think, and many African economists think that China's growth will help realize the ideals of the African continental free, help in realizing the African continental free trade area ideals. Implementation challenges, of course, inadequate infrastructure remains a challenge. In Africa, it's difficult to move from one country to another by road. In fact, within one country, like the DRC, for example, it's not easy to drive from one country, from Goma to Kinshasa, for example. It's a hassle. It's almost impossible. So if you move from the south to the north of DRC, that is one country. The same applies to so many African states. So physical infrastructure is a challenge, and China is doing a great job in that. Social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, that is healthcare, education, is also a challenge. Access to healthcare, access to education. Maternal and child mortality in Africa is high because many African villages are far away from healthcare centers and hospitals. Institutionalization or institutional development, of course, is also a challenge. climate change and fast population growth. Africa is having the fastest population growth in the world. This population growth need the population of Africa. This increase in population calls for increase in services such as education, many more schools, many more hospitals to treat this big population. Climate change is also bringing a big challenge to Africa. We see flooding in South Sudan in the last 6-7 years, constant flooding, and it's here to stay. These climate change challenges will be there for 50, 60, 70 years. So Africa has to learn from now to adjust to the challenges of climate change. Debt trap and vanity projects such as airports that are not being used, airports in the middle of nowhere. These such projects are called vanity projects because they will not be used, and these African countries will have to pay for them. Look at the football stadia in South Africa that were built to host the 2010 World Cup. They were built by the Chinese with billions of dollars, but many of these huge football stadiums are not being used by South African teams. These are called vanity projects. China non-interference policy, weaponization of conflicts, non-interference policy. China's non-interference policy is seen as a challenge because it is propping up dictatorship. If you build infrastructure, if you finance, you give loans to dictators, then you are repeating what happened by the World Bank and the IMF, by the Western world before the rise of China, where people like Mobutu Sese Seko received billions of dollars, and the Congolese are now paying for them, but they are not seeing this, the benefits of these loans. Idi Amin received loans from the World Bank, from the IMF. The Ugandans are paying for these loans, but so the idea of non-interference is seen as a challenge. China needs now to adjust that policy, to give loans and see that these loans are actually benefiting the people, because it is the people that are going to pay back these loans. The issue of rules of origin, protectionism, is also a challenge. For example, if you have goods coming from one country to Kenya, for example, because Kenya has a port, sugar coming to Kenya, since the AfCFTA says that there is only one tariff that is going to be single tariff principle, then Kenya will get these tariffs, taxes from this sugar, but again it will pass the cost of this tariff to all other African countries, because if Kenya, to simplify it, if Kenyan companies produce cake and put this sugar into processed goods and go and sell this sugar in Uganda, sweet products in Uganda, Kenya, in DRC, and it is passing the cost to the consumers not in Kenya, but the consumers across other African countries. The rules of origin is the biggest challenge by far. That must be dealt with. That must be managed well under the TFCA. Otherwise, protectionism will come up and destroy the ideals of AfCFTA. Crippling non-tariff barriers, roadblocks, we see them a lot, even in South Sudan. Just from Nimoli to Juba, you have 6, 7, 8 roadblocks going from Juba to Upper Nile by boat. The aid agencies are complaining of almost 70 roadblocks along the River Nile. It adds cost to transporting these goods. Harmonization of standards is also a challenge that is facing, that will face the AfCFTA, because it is still facing even the well-developed European Union. So all in all, this presentation was meant, as I said earlier, to inform or to discuss with university students in South Sudan, those that are doing economics, those that are doing development studies, and that are doing law, especially community law, economic community law, and of course, because it is recorded, they will go through it again and again and add to what they already have, or it is just a contribution to what they already have, what they are already receiving from their lecturers. I hope to continue along the same path. I'm thinking of giving a couple more lectures on U.S. environmental and natural resources law and policy, just highlights here and there to aid in the comparative study, because the U.S. environmental and natural resources law and policy is very developed. And as we in Africa try to develop our own, we cannot do it without a comparative study between, without borrowing from a place like the United States of America. Thank you, and God bless you. God bless South Sudan, and God bless Africa in general. Thank you so much. Stay blessed.